Have you ever been in the middle of a race, whether in sim racing or real life, and suddenly realize your focus is just gone? One moment, you're nailing every apex, hitting your marks, setting consistent lap times, and the next, you're missing braking zones, overshooting corners, just making basic mistakes. Well, at some point, it has happened to all of us, and that's exactly what I want to talk about today. Why losing focus can completely ruin your performance, and more importantly, how to fix it. And yes, there is a fix for it, so stick around to the end to learn a new exercise which will improve your focus. First off, let's break down what losing focus actually looks like. It's not always something dramatic like spinning out or locking up the brakes. Sometimes it's subtle. Maybe you're a fraction of a second late on turn-in, or you're applying just a bit too much throttle on exit and unsettling the rear tires just that little bit. Regardless of how it shows up, the end result is always the same. You lose rhythm and your consistency falls apart. If there's one thing we know about racing, it's that consistency is what separates those good drivers from the great ones. The problem gets worse when you let these mistakes snowball. Let's say you miss a braking point into a key overtaking zone. Instead of resetting mentally and focusing immediately on the next corner, a lot of the times what happens is that you keep replaying that mistake in your head. Now you're distracted, and that one error turns into a chain reaction. This is something that I see all the time, both in sim racing and real life, and once you're stuck in this cycle, it's often impossible to recover or very difficult at a bare minimum. But why does this happen? To understand it, we need to look at a few key factors. The first is going to be what we like to call cognitive overload. So racing requires processing an immense amount of information in real time, whether it's braking markers, steering input, tire feedback, and spatial awareness of other drivers around you. When your brain becomes overwhelmed, your ability to process these signals starts to deteriorate, and that's when mistakes start to creep in. Then there's the issue of distractions. Sometimes they're external, like a poorly timed spotter call or background noises breaking your focus. But more often than not, distractions are actually internal. For example, dwelling on a mistake or becoming frustrated after losing a position. This kind of mental interference puts you out of the moment, breaking that feedback loop between you and the car, which is of course critical for maintaining that performance when driving. Finally, we have fatigue, both mental and physical. In longer stints or endurance races, your focus naturally starts to fade. Now, of course, this often isn't about literally staying awake, but it's about maintaining the mental stamina to process data and make quick, precise decisions lap after lap. When fatigue sets in, reaction times slow, muscle memory becomes less reliable, and even small errors feel amplified. When you're in the zone, what we like to call the flow state, your inputs are essentially synchronized with the car's dynamics. So how do you actually stay focused when driving a race car? And more importantly, how do you recover when you've lost the focus? The answer isn't simply to try harder. Focus is a skill, and like any skill, it can be trained. Before we get into the main secret that I use, let's talk about what I like to call the controllable and the uncontrollable variables when racing. Now, something that a lot of people overlook when doing anything is the amount of bandwidth the human brain has. What I mean by this is if you're trying to process too much information at once, your brain may get overburdened, which is why you might end up making those mistakes in the first place. Now, one thing I try to preach to drivers when I'm coaching them is to control as much information and as many inputs as possible through the subconscious mind, while leaving some headroom for the uncontrollable variables that you may see on track. This is because the subconscious mind is far more powerful than the conscious. So before you get into a race, make sure you have everything to do with your car, your inputs, and your driving down as a part of the subconscious brain, so you don't have to actively think about it when racing wheel to wheel, thus allowing you to leave bandwidth on the table for things like other cars out on track battling with you, crashes, etc. Again, which are things you cannot necessarily fully plan for. So how can you ensure your own driving is not taking up too much bandwidth? You can do this by having processes and plans in place, like accurate references that you can burn into your mind during practice, for example. Now, that's a whole other topic that I've already discussed in other videos, so I recommend going into my channel, watching my other videos if you want to get more information on those processes. Now, if you remember back to the start of the video, fatigue is one of the main reasons why people lose focus. So if you can ensure you're not overworking your brain with things that shouldn't require too much conscious activity, you'll be able to stay more focused overall. So now that we got those basic things out of the way, I want to talk about one of the things that I use to snap back into a focused state when driving. Now, this technique is something called NLP anchoring, which stands for neuro-linguistic programming. It's a psychological method designed to help you associate a specific gesture or stimulus with a desired mental state. Now, let's be realistic here. It's almost physically impossible to be focused 100% of the time, but one thing we can do is ensure these lapses in concentration are as minimal as possible before we quickly get back to this flow state. Now, let me break this down in the context of racing. Here's how it works. There are 4 steps to creating an anchor, and each one is critical to ensuring it works under pressure. The first step is what we like to call recall. You need to think back to a time where you were in a flow state, when you were completely focused. Now, for this step, close your eyes if you really need to and really visualize this state of focus. Think about how it felt, the confidence, the calm, and the control you had in that moment. This isn't about just remembering, it's about reliving that moment and recalling that exact feeling. Now, the second step is anchor, but it really comes into play at the same moment when you're doing step 1. Now, while you're visualizing that moment at its absolute peak, you need to introduce a unique physical action or stimulus, something you wouldn't normally do while driving, so you don't accidentally trigger this anchor when you don't intend to do so. Typical anchors outside of racing might be something like squeezing a specific knuckle on your hand in a particular way, but one thing I would highly recommend in regard to doing it while racing is to ensure your anchor is relatively easy to complete ergonomically without taking your hands too far off of where they need to be on the wheel. The key is to make it something simple and repeatable, but unique enough that your brain can associate it with that specific memory and action that you're recalling. As an example, my anchor to engage my brain back into a flow state is by gripping or pulsating my wheel 2 times in a very specific way. That way my brain knows exactly when to trigger that flow state, but it's also not too far off of the wheel and quick enough where I can do it in between 2 corners if need be. I recommend doing this process a few times to really ingrain it in your mind. The third step is to change your state. Once you've locked in that physical action while visualizing your flow state, take a moment to break the pattern. Look around, drink some water, or do something completely unrelated. This interrupts the process and ensures that when you use the anchor later, it doesn't just blend into your normal routine. Finally, the 4th step is to physically test that anchor. Once you finish breaking your state, use the physical gesture or stimulus you've chosen, like tapping the wheel or pressing your fingers together, and see if it brings back that feeling of flow state. If it works, you've successfully created an anchor. If not, you may need to repeat that process to get back that flow state and to really ingrain it in your mind. Now, let's talk about how this directly applies to racing. Say you're midway through a long stint and your focus starts to slip. Whether it's a big or small mistake, you can probably feel your rhythm breaking down. And instead of letting it spiral, let's try using this anchor to snap yourself out of that downwards trend. Now, the effectiveness of anchoring depends on a few factors, of course. First, the intensity of the memory you're anchoring is crucial. The stronger the emotional connection to that flow state, the more reliable your anchor is going to be. And number 2 is timing. You want to create that anchor at the exact peak of that memory when you're fully immersed into the feeling of being in control. Third is going to be the uniqueness of the anchor. If the action is something you do all the time, like shifting gears or resting your hand on the wheel, it won't stick. And finally, consistency is key. The more often you practice activating your anchor, the more effective it will become under pressure. Now, one last point I want to make is that anchoring isn't a magic trick. It's a tool, and like any tool, it takes a lot of practice to master. The more you use it, the more natural it's going to feel, and eventually it may become an automatic part of your routine. Believe it or not, real-life pro drivers use this technique all the time. Now, to be fair, it's sometimes in a verbal form by saying something out loud, but they're often just not aware that this is actually a psychological tool that many professionals use. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.